Good morning, afternoon, evening, and welcome to Concerned Citizens Presents, a new offering on Village TV. Concerned Citizens of Laguna Woods is an organization committed to peace, social justice, economic equality, and a clean environment. For the duration of the lockdown, instead of its usual 2 meetings a month, Concerned Citizens will broadcast 2 programs a month on this channel. Our programs will feature films, lectures, and debates on topics related to our mission. We hope you enjoy today's program.
Welcome to Concerned Citizens Presents. My name is Suzanne Modell, and I chair the committee responsible for these broadcasts. Concerned Citizens' mission statement includes a commitment to economic and social justice. In that vein, we have devoted programs to many of the familiar types of injustice: sexual harassment, homelessness, domestic violence, police misconduct. Today, we focus on algorithmic injustice, a less familiar but equally worrisome vehicle for rewarding the strong and penalizing the weak. Our guest is Cathy O'Neill, founder of O'Neill Risk Consulting and Algorithmic Auditing, a company that helps firms develop just algorithms. She is the creator of Math Babe, a progressive feminist blog, and author of Weapons of Math Destruction, a clearly written, entertaining indictment of the algorithm industry. In 2016, the book was longlisted for the National Book Award and won the Euler Prize, which is awarded annually to an outstanding book in mathematics. Currently, Dr. O'Neill appears prominently in the Netflix documentary Coded Bias. She holds a BA from UC Berkeley and a PhD from Harvard. Her previous jobs include working for a hedge fund and teaching at Barnard. She participated in the Occupy Wall Street movement, is a talented pianist, and the mother of 3 sons. Welcome, Cathy O'Neill.
Yeah, I mean, the short version is I left my math professorship at Barnard and joined finance just when it was falling apart, like not knowing anything about anything really, just naively thinking mathematics was a tool that could and would be used for good. But then when I saw like the AAA rated mortgage-backed securities blowing up the system, and I also knew a little bit about the risk scores that were behind those AAA ratings, I realized they were lies, but that people sort of blindly trusted mathematics. And so you could really propagate lies and you could sort of just make money off of it to whatever detriment of society at large. And that is basically the story from that I think to myself. It wasn't just the AAA rated mortgages, it was also the risk scores, the various risk models. So I actually spent 2 years at the hedge fund, left because I was disgusted with how badly the risk was working. So I worked in risk for a couple of years, and I even worked on the risk of credit default swaps. And then I quickly realized that actually this was not a problem you could solve with better mathematics. It wasn't just like, oh, the math was accidentally wrong. In fact, I made it better. And people were like, no, we don't actually want it to be better, Cathy. Like, you don't understand. We want to underestimate our risk. And I was like, oh, okay, so this is bullshit by design. And we're just putting a little math PhD branding on it. I didn't want to be part of that, so I left and I joined Occupy. So that's the answer to that question. But I still had to make a living, so I became a data scientist because I was like, again, naively thinking, not quite as naively this time, that maybe I could use my mathematical skills for good in the world of data science. But then, of course, the shift there was not very large. It was like from predicting markets to predicting humans. And so the same techniques were kind of relevant. I was very good at my job, but I quickly realized in that context that in fact I was feeding into the same exact problem, i.e., people trusted us. They assumed that what we were doing was objective and thoughtful, and in fact, it was pretty crappy. But it did do one thing pretty well. It segregated people by class, race, and gender. And just thinking through what that means, and what it really means is like I was in charge of deciding who was deserving and who was undeserving. And, based on like, oh, people like you were considered undeserving in the past, so we're going to consider you undeserving. The way I say it sometimes is like we make lucky people luckier and unlucky people unluckier. And I was like, wait, hold on a second. This is just like the crappy models that blew up Wall Street, but nobody sees it. It's invisible, because even the people who are being shuttled to the deny category, they didn't even know that they had an opportunity that they had missed. So it wasn't like, like the good news about the financial crisis was that everyone noticed it. Like you wouldn't think of that as good news, but in retrospect, that is the good news. Like people were like, oh, the market is crashing. We need to do something about this. Like bailing out the big banks wasn't the right thing to do, but like at least we noticed, Whereas I was realizing in the world of big data, we're just like putting prisoners in prison longer because they look like people that will be profiled by the police in the future. Like and we think that we're doing is scientific and objective, and it's actually just propagating racism and inequality. So that's a long answer to a short question.
That's fine. Great. Okay. Well, it certainly gives us a sense of how you were kind of working with power, and that kind of was unsettling. So, in terms of talking about your work and what you discovered, I think the best way to start is to start the way that your book does, which is to talk a little bit about sports teams and how algorithms are used by managers of sports teams in selecting players and maybe even letting them go, and because you argue that approach is fair, and I think that's a great baseline to kind of build on.
Now, just to be clear, I never claim that everybody in a given algorithmic context is totally happy with the system, because of course any definition of success for a sports team or what have you is going to mean some people are demoted who used to enjoy high ranking. So those people aren't going to be particularly satisfied. What I mean to say about that, which I like, is that first of all, the data is clean and it's public, because the data for a given baseball game is literally broadcast to the nation. People will chew over whether it should have been described as an error or a base hit for days on sports radio. The point is that like that kind of cleanliness of data is like absolutely impossible to find in most contexts. So you have this really, really nice, clean, available data set. And you also have a very well-defined definition of success, which is to win games. Whereas a lot of the time in the real world with algorithms, the definition of success differs depending on, very much differs depending on who you are. So like Facebook wants to make money, so they optimize their algorithm to their definition of success, which is keeping you on Facebook, because the longer you're on Facebook, the more you click and the more profit they make. So it's very highly correlated to profit. Whereas your definition of success on Facebook, it probably isn't, I want to stay on Facebook as long as possible, right? In fact, we know that the side effect of them optimizing to keeping us on Facebook is all sorts of misinformation, because that's what gets us really riled up and into fights. The point is that our perspective on what success looks like is really different from Facebook's. But in sports, generally speaking, the team and its fans all want to win a game. Now, there could be some little a discussion of whether do we want to win a given game or do we want to win the World Series or blah, blah, blah. But it's very, very highly correlated to the same concept of winning. So those two things, that you have very clear data and that you have very clear definition of success, means that you can really have dueling concepts, and you can have objective sort of measurements of whether one person's metric for whether a given player is good is better or worse than a different team's metric for whether a player is better, worse, or better. So in other words, when some general manager comes up with a new kind of Moneyball way of thinking about putting together a team, it's a system that could fail or could work, but it's data driven, and like you can test it, and that's what we see, and that's good. It's a feedback mechanism. So if it doesn't work, they get fired or they have to replace it. It has this feedback. It has a good feedback loop, which is to say failures are noticed and corrected, and successes are noticed and encouraged, and that's kind of what's missing in a lot of the other examples.
Right. Okay. Well, that's a point also that in other words, that in the baseball situation or basketball or whatever, the owners and managers continue to collect data, right? So that they check again and again and refine their models. They don't just simply assume that a decision they made is correct and just keep on making it.
Right. That's a really good example. So if you contrast this, let's talk about a baseball team, because I'm much more of a baseball fan than anything else, to be honest. If they trade away a player and that player goes on to do really, really well on another team, they're going to be like, we screwed up, right? Whereas if you read my book, and you'll see that there's a lot of algorithms deciding who deserves a job, who's going to be good at a job. If you say no to someone, in fact, if you filter them out of even getting an interview, which most of these things do, you'll never know if you missed an opportunity to have a really good job candidate. That person's gone forever and you're not keeping track of it. So there's that the false negatives are kept track of, and that's a really important part of the feedback loop, that it's a good feedback loop, that it actually encourages success and discourages failure.
Great. Okay. So let's contrast that. Can you talk about some contexts where managers are using algorithms in hiring or firing or promotion decisions that are blatantly unfair? Give us some examples.
Well, one of the examples I have in my book is an example of Kyle Beam, who was a young man who tried to get a job at a grocery store, bagging groceries in Atlanta, Georgia. I mean, he was super qualified for it. But he, having gotten straight A's in high school and going to Vanderbilt, but he'd also taken time out to be treated for bipolar disorder. And so when he applied for the job, they required him to take a personality test, which he took earnestly and failed. What he was lucky, I mean, he was unlucky because he got blocked from getting a job at Kroger's, not just one Kroger's, by the way, I should mention all of Kroger's. Like, he was never going to be allowed to work there in any of the stores. But he was fortunate to notice something, namely that some of the questions he had been asked in the personality test were exactly the same questions he'd been asked at the mental hospital. It's a mental health assessment, basically. And he was also fortunate because his dad is a lawyer, and most people applying to minimum wage work just don't have access to a lawyer, never mind their own dad. And so his dad looked into it and was like, wait, that's illegal under the Americans with Disability Act. And he actually got Kyle to apply to 6 other jobs that all use the same personality test. Kyle got rejected from all 7 of those jobs. And then his dad filed class action lawsuits on behalf of anyone who'd ever taken any of those tests for any of those jobs. And by the way, I should mention that those 7 lawsuits are still stuck in the courts. And one of the reasons they're stuck in the courts is because, quite a few of them passed the first bar, which is the questions did not have business necessity, which is, so they got pushed to the next step. Like, there's no particular reason you have to be asked these personality test questions in order to perform the job of a grocer. So that's a good thing for the lawsuit. But the bad thing about the lawsuit, and I'm not saying it's significantly permanently bad, but it's bad temporarily anyway, is that the EEOC, the regulator that actually joined some of the lawsuits, just simply doesn't know how to assess an algorithm, doesn't know how to make the case legally that the algorithm is illegal.
Right. So there's a kind of lag there in knowledge base.
Yes.
What about? I actually really found your story about the student learning as an indicator of teacher effectiveness as pretty important. Also, not only because of the unfairness many of us may have read about it, at the time when teachers are, being given promotions or fired because their students don't show that they've gained enough in a year's learning. But also, I thought the matter of gaming the system comes up. So, okay, maybe Kyle didn't know what was going on, but sometimes people do figure out what's going on. And that adds like another layer of injustice and confusion. So could you talk a little bit about teacher evaluations and gaming the system and that whole ball of wax?
Sure. And I'll start by mentioning that this teacher accountability system, which was pushed both by Obama and by Bush, and the No Race to the Top and No Child Left Behind, was bipartisan sort of accountability, and I'm putting that in scare quotes, was only really high stakes in urban school districts. And I'll say why, but I'll just say right now, it was arbitrary and punishing, and it, instead of getting rid of the worst teachers in a given school district, it actually just got rid of the best teachers. So it failed on all counts, and it wasn't consistent for all public schools. Again, it was only essentially for poor kids of color. So talk about injustice. What it was an algorithm that was very complicated. Nobody could explain it to the teachers who were being fired based on it, or given bonuses based on high scores. That purported to measure the value added of a teacher for a given classroom. What it actually did was it took scores from last year and guessed at the scores that these same students would have this year, and then measure the difference between what actually happened with the kids' scores and the expected scores. So the difference between those two things is an error term, also called a noise term, on the model of the guessing model. And so you're talking about a teacher who's being evaluated and literally going to be fired if the number is too low, based on 24 noise terms. So it all depends on whether that guessing model, the guess as to what your score will be next year based on last year, was it all good or appropriate or relevant. And the information I have, which is really hard to get, and it's not up to me that we got it, but is that it's essentially a random number generator. So there's a reason I'm calling it a noise term. So having said that, Sue, you're absolutely right that it was gameable, because again, it's all about test scores, right? So when I say noise, the reason I'm saying it's highly noisy is because the truth is there's all sorts of reasons kids will have weird scores in a given year. Like, what if it's a hot day and the air conditioning system doesn't work, or they don't have air conditioning system, or they didn't eat, or they just didn't sleep, or whatever. There's all sorts of things that will make much more of a difference than a teacher, just whether they like the subject this year versus last year. I mean, there's so many things, right? So to hold the teacher accountable for the gain of from this year from previous years doesn't make a lot of sense, because there's just not enough data. Maybe if a teacher had 4,000 students, you could see some statistical information there, but typically classrooms are small. But what it is obvious is that if you cheat on the kids' scores, they'll be inflated. So you will have proven gain, or not proven, or you will have measured gain in these scores. So that's what teachers did. They cheated, or maybe the principals cheated, because the principal or the teachers were at risk of getting fired if the scores were low, or getting a bonus if the scores were high. So they had every incentive in the world to cheat, because that would artificially inflate that gap, that sort of value added measurement. The problem, of course, is that when you receive students, and I talked to Sarah Wasaki, who this happened to her. She received students who had really high scores the previous year, and she was a third grade teacher, but they couldn't read or write or do basic math. So she had every reason to think that those scores from last year had been cheated on by the teachers in order to get better scores. But what happens to her is that because these students had such high scores last year, she is expected to give them high scores this year. And since she's not cheating, it didn't happen, and she got fired. So that's the story there. And by the way, the investigation into that set of incidents was just thrown away because it was Washington, D.C. under Michelle Rhee, who was just awful. And she fired principals on live television just to show how tough she was. She was like tough on crime type, awful school.
There's a mini Trump.
She was like, a little bit of a Trump, yeah.
Right. Okay, so that's colorful. I think our audience is getting the idea. Let's try a different context. All right, so we've talked about hiring and firing, algorithmic injustice. So what about staffing decisions? Could you talk about how algorithms help managers decide when to open and close their businesses, as well as how many employees they need and when they need them, and what the consequences of these precise predictions are?
Yeah, I mean, and before I go on, I'll just mention that I talked to a bunch of teachers who got bad scores, or a bunch of principals whose teachers got scored by that system that I just mentioned. I asked them, what happened? How did you feel when you got a bad score? And they were all like, well, I asked questions. I tried to push back, but they all told me it was math and I wouldn't understand it. They basically were told, they were math shamed, I call it. Mm-hmm. So this is a recurring theme in my experience, that there's a lot of if you don't have a PhD in math, you don't have the right to ask questions going on. And I do have a PhD in math, as you mentioned, Sue. So I'm always like, what? That doesn't work. If someone said that to me, I'd say, if you can't explain it to me, then it's invalid. So that kind of disconnect was one of my primary impulses for writing the book, was just explaining that math isn't actually a weapon, or shouldn't be a weapon, that if math is not explaining something, then it's not being done right. But to your question, I found a lots of scheduling algorithms out there, and it's kind of shocking and astonishing. But you'll find articles, published articles written by these folks. Now I'm trying to remember the name of it. The people who write these algorithms. And to be clear, they were originally written, and I think Frank would know a lot about this possibly. They were written to optimize large computer systems, to decide which servers should be being used at a given time, some kind of parallel processing computation that you can't. Frank, you're nodding. Is that a no? I don't know what you're talking about. Anyway, the idea was you try to give jobs to different computers. This is back when, I'm sure they do that kind of thing at some level in the Amazon cloud as well, but it's below the surface. But back then you had to actually say, hey, you computer, do this computation while the other computers are busy, and blah, blah, blah. And so it was that idea that you had a kind of computer that was always ready to be on or off, and you wanted to optimize the scheduling for it so that you can get your overall computation done as quickly as possible. But that kind of concept was applied instead to humans in the context of large stores like Walmart, in terms of shifts, which people do we need on what part of the floor. It's going to rain tomorrow, so actually we're going to have fewer people. So tell these people who were on call not to come. We don't, and also there was a paper I found that literally said, now it has this new algorithm that we just developed, commercial algorithm for scheduling shift workers, has an option that you can, toggle this little switch and make sure that no one has more than 32 hours a week so that you won't have to pay benefits. And so this is done. This is really, truly done. And it is done using that real-time data like the weather reports, it's done to minimize the number of people ever in the store at a time, so that you don't actually have people stealing stuff, but and like the customers are somewhat satisfied, but the workers are maximally exhausted. You have the situation where people do not know their schedule until the day they're working often. They never have a regular schedule because these algorithms simply don't make those, they just do not meet those constraints. So the way I look at it is it's kind of a degradation of the concept of work. I mean, never mind that the work itself is demeaning just because it's so minimized in terms of like what you're actually allowed to accomplish. It means that a given person can't have a second job, for example, because their shifts are so irregular. They can't have childcare. They can't go to night school. All those things that we tell the working poor to do in order to improve their lives are made impossible by this kind of algorithm, and yet there's nothing illegal about it.
Right. I guess part of the maybe our audience is not as sensitive to this as I am. Two colleagues of mine at the University of Massachusetts wrote a book called Unequal Time, Gender, Class, and Family in Employment Schedules, which helped to raise consciousness that there's a large swath of the population that doesn't know from one day to the next whether or not they'll be working or what times they're going to be working. And for most people, that's very disturbing. And if you're a single mother, it's practically crippling. But naturally, I mean, it's a kind of extension of Taylorism, or the idea, that we're going to maximize every single unit's efficiency, and we really don't care at all about how much they're suffering, so long as we can get them to do it. And in the current labor environment, employers certainly can get people to do all kinds of things. Okay, let's move to the criminal justice system. Could you talk a little bit, you do in your book, about how judges use algorithms in their sentencing decisions?
Yeah, and this isn't just sentencing, it's also used for parole decisions, and for that matter, for like whether someone who's leaving prison after serving their term is further incarcerated. I've been working on a pro bono case for that final situation for a man who was in prison for 40 years and then given parole, but then because of a risk scoring system, which, by the way, did not change his level of risk from the moment he committed the crime when he was 17 years old and then tried it as an adult, to the moment when he was 59, which is when they decided his risk was too high and he was very likely to, they argued, recommit this crime, which really doesn't happen among older men. Anyway, so and by the way, like in his case, his name is Oscar Jones. They actually used 3 or 4 different tests until they found one that had high enough scores for him to stay incarcerated. So there are lots of different kinds of risk scores. They're called like recidivism risk score. Recidivism simply means that you'll return to prison. And I really want to be careful when I speak, because it's not at all measuring whether you're a criminal and you'll do something criminal. It's really measuring whether you'll be arrested. And the reason I'm distinguishing between those two things is because the high level problem here, which I have to mention every time I talk about this, is that we don't have crime data in this country. We simply do not have crime data. We talk about crime data all the time, but what we have is arrest data, and we have reported crime data. And those two sets of data are very, very bad proxies for crime. Very bad proxies for crime. I'll just say a few things about that and then go to my larger point. And there might be crime categories like car theft, where it's actually a pretty good measurement of the crime. But for the most part, things like pot smoking, most people just get away with it. And most people don't get arrested for pot smoking. But if you look at who does get arrested for pot smoking, even though white people and black people smoke pot at the same rate to their own when they're asked, 5 times more black people get arrested for smoking pot. And they don't just get arrested randomly, they get arrested in their neighborhoods. And so what happens there is that you have this geographic location associated to an arrest, which is then considered a so-called crime hotspot because of the way police profile and arrest young black boys essentially for things like pot smoking, but not young white boys who live 2 blocks away. And I know this from living like 2 blocks away from Harlem at Columbia, where every 3 years there would be like a huge drug bust in one of the frats, but like never anybody get arrested in between those moments for pot smoking. Not that I want pot smoking to be criminalized, by the way. This is just the crime category where we know the most because people are willing to admit they smoke pot. So we know that white people and black people smoke pot at similar rates, and we also look at the arrest data and see that black people are arrested far, far more often. In other crime categories like rape, we just don't know how often rape occurs. And it's very underreported. It's even more underreported in certain situations where the trust of the police is low. In Houston, among the Latino population, the reporting of rape went down 40% when Trump was elected. Just to show you how weak a proxy this reported crime is, or arrests are to actual crime. So there's crimes out there happening everywhere, and then there's this tiny little data set we call crime data, which is just stupid. We call it, we should call it arrest data, because that's really what we're talking about. And to wrap it up, the crime risk scores that we talked about that are being used for sentencing. If you get a higher crime risk score, you get sentenced to longer. If you get a higher crime risk score, you don't get parole. If you get a higher crime risk score, you don't actually get let out of prison after you're done with your sentence, or you get forced to stay incarcerated before your trial. That's what these things are used for. What they're actually measure is the following: do you look like someone who will get arrested in the future? That's what they're all asking. And so if you think about that, if you think, what's predictable about someone that will make them more likely to be arrested, then if you just think through what that looks like, you'll know what the questionnaire is that accompanies these crime risk scores. They ask questions like proxies for race and class, like, do you live in a high crime neighborhood? That's a code word for a black neighborhood. They ask, do you have a mental health disorder that's untreated? Do you have an addiction? Because we criminalize addiction, we criminalize mental health problems. It asks, are you poor? Are you on welfare? That's literally, if you say yes, then your crime risk score goes up and you're more likely to be sentenced for longer in prison. It doesn't have to do with your actual criminality. It has to do with the likelihood that you will be arrested by police in the future.
Right. Okay. I just want to throw out a little challenge here. As I'm sure you know, in a new book, co-author Daniel Kahneman maintains that more judges should rely on algorithms because algorithms reduce noise. And actually, that's the name of the book, Noise. And he discusses noise just as you very beautifully described it in the case of the students being tested at the end of the year, where, you know, noise might mean that the air conditioning isn't working on a hot day. Noise might mean that you didn't have breakfast. And evidently, Kahneman cites, he's a co-author there. I think Sunstein is another author of this book. It's a pretty prominent set of folks. And they're saying that judges will make different judge sentencing decisions on the same day, depending on whether it's morning or afternoon. So we need to get rid of this noise and essentially rely more on algorithms. So what's your response to that, Cathy?
Well, my response to that is that I've seen a paper that asks humans on Mechanical Turk, which are like to say people paid by the hour to do tasks online to guess as to who's going to be rearrested, and they get as accurate just based on their picture, just based on a picture, and I think maybe they're told the age. They get as accurate recidivism risk rating as the algorithms. So it's just like basically a crowdsourced, does this guy look like he's going to get arrested by the cops in the future? That kind of bias is what we're actually getting out of the risk scores. So I guess what I'm saying is it's not enough for it to be statistically unnoisy if it is just pure bias. If it is like unfair to the core, but it's consistently unfair to the core, why is that better than something that's slightly noisy? And by the way, I'm not vouching for judges here. Judges are in fact highly biased and noisy. I would like us to rethink what prison is for, rather than say, oh, whatever we're doing, let's just iteratively make it statistically less noisy and then we're good. Like, I don't think so. We haven't defined, and I know I've said this before, like, it's all about the definition of success. Basically like for Facebook, optimizing to keeping us on Facebook means profit for them. I feel like that's a really crap definition of success for us, the public. It has created little filter bubbles where we all hate each other and half of us are conspiracy theorists. I feel like we have a similarly crap definition of success for prisons. So we want to I think the reckoning that we need isn't tweaking the algorithm or tweaking the judges for that matter. It is rethinking what prison is for, rethinking what success looks like. What does it mean that we have had our prisons are successful? Because right now what we're doing is we're creating conditions in prisons that make people less capable of living outside of prison. That's a way more important question for me than how accurate versus noisy are these shitty, biased algorithms.
Right. Okay. I'm sure we're all in agreement on that. Let me turn the question around a little. Actually, a question I was going to ask you, but I think I'm just going to assert it rather than ask it because the question to follow is more interesting. I was going to ask you to tell us about how police departments use algorithms to identify criminals, but I'm sure our audience can kind of imagine that. We know a lot about driving while black, or people targeting a certain group, stop and frisk, and so forth. And the consequences are horrendous. Also, because just like jail creates criminals, there's also evidence that they don't simply being stopped. In other words, if the authority figures are constantly assuming that you're going to commit a crime, there's some causal influence that has. It is related to increasing the probability that you will. So this is really a problem, this phenomenon of identifying, let's say, bad apples with algorithms. But let me turn the question around, Cathy, and ask you this. Do you think police departments might use algorithms to identify abusive cops?
Yeah, I was thinking that for a long time. Like the very first time I was introduced to this topic, this very broad topic, was at a so-called hackathon. And I blogged about it on MathBait, by the way. I think it was in 2013. And we opened up the stop and frisk data. And we were trying to demonstrate for the ACLU, actually the NYCLU, or the New York version of the ACLU, that it was incredibly racially biased, and we really did help them make that case, and it was declared non-constitutional with some of the data that we helped them infer, some of the statistics, I should say. But one of the things I noticed that weekend when we opened up that data was that there was a lot of information on the people they stopped and frisked, and what had been scrubbed from the data was any kind of identifying information about the police, about the officers. And so what I would have liked to do was do a kind of worst cop analysis. Like, who are the cops that seem to be very, very prominently stopping and frisking the most young Black men that don't have any weapons, that don't, that they are charged but not convicted. Like, there was all sorts of messy things happening. I mean, the actual conviction rate for the stop and frisk stops was like 0.01% or something. It was just harassment. So it would have been really, really good to be able to track the harassment. Who are the worst harassers? But that information was not provided. And that's, one of the most, I'd say the themes of my book, which is, and my work, which is that we get data about powerless people, but the data about the powerful people is always hard to find, if not impossible. And I'll just say another thing about the noise issue. I had a chance to talk to Mr. Kahneman at some point. I would love to have a public debate with him a second time. Which is that, the noise is a problem. Noise is a problem for so many reasons, but I think one of the reasons that you'll find people who are professors not worrying too much about it is that their sons and daughters get things corrected when a mistake is made and they're rejected from a job unfairly. Whereas the average person, the average worker, doesn't have access to, they get processed by machines and they have no appeal system. Whereas like well-off, educated, rich people have they get curated attention, and they get to call the principal if their son or daughter had a mistake made on their record. I'm just saying, like, noise is fine for other people, but for myself and my friends, like, we like to have the mistakes corrected. Thank you very much.
Right. Okay. Let's try just one more context. What we're trying to do is show that there are many aspects of life in which algorithms are kind of behind the scenes, or as you were mentioning with the teachers, that originally you don't even really know what's going on. So let's talk a little bit about pricing, which you discuss in your book. You talk about several products and services where algorithms are used in a kind of unfair way to decide how much to charge someone. Insurance is a big example, or loans. Maybe you could talk some about that.
Yeah, so I will say, by the way, as an aside, most of the pricing that people get up in arms about doesn't bother me that much. There's a lot of pricing that is essentially a nuisance charge for people that aren't interested in searching further. And it's kind of like a tax on the rich. I'm kind of okay with it.
I'm sorry, could you explain what you mean by that? I'm not sure everyone understands.
Yeah, there are companies, and I don't know how systemic these are, because the tests I've seen run haven't been very decisive. That that, like, if I'm looking for a hotel,
yes,
with a Mac, it'll show me more expensive hotel stays first, and I'll have to scroll down to see the cheap ones. But if I used a cheaper computer, I would see those cheaper ones sooner. And I just don't think that's so bad. Like, it's thinking, oh, you're a Mac user, you're going to want to stay in a nice hotel. Like, it's basically, and by the way, not impossible to find those cheaper hotels. So that's a tax on the rich, and I'm just saying, like, not that big a deal for me. It's not actually.
Okay, but it's also an important baseline point, it seemed to me, and maybe it's obvious, is that particularly when you're shopping online, but not only when you're shopping online, that not everyone is paying the same price.
In this case, it's not a question of what you're paying for the same product. It's you're not seeing the same things.
Okay, that too.
Now, I haven't seen. Yeah, so let's go back to the example of insurance.
Right.
Or loans. I mean, I think anything that's tailored to a given person, like for a loan or like a car loan or a car insurance, that's when they decide how much to charge you. And we're so used to it that it's like it's a no-brainer to us. But like if you're applying for a student loan, like depending on your FICO score and your where you live and who you are, you're going to get charged more or less. And I don't have to say this out loud, but it's true. Like if you're poorer, you get charged more, right? So that is a tax on the poor. People are so used to that because of FICO scores being part of the fabric of our society that we really do feel like there's a relationship between your FICO score and your deservedness, like your
What's your
worthiness.
FICO score? Sorry, what's your FICO
credit score? Sorry, your credit score. So people are they're so convinced that credit scores are sort of like stamps of worthiness that it's like, of course you're going to pay more for an opportunity to go to school if you're poorer and don't have as good a FICO score. But that's certainly a fact. Less convincingly obvious to people, and I would say that I'm saying it that way because I don't think the first thing should be obvious to people, is car insurance, which, you're like, well, I should pay more for my car insurance if I'm a bad driver. That makes more sense to people. But for some reason, in some states, and not all states, but in some states, it is allowed, the car insurance are allowed to charge more if you have a bad FICO score. So you'll have examples, and ProPublica did this, and Consumer Reports worked on this as well. You'll have examples where you have a perfect driving record, you live in a tough neighborhood, and your credit score is middling, but you have a perfect driving record, and you're paying more in insurance than another guy who has a DUI on his record but is living in a ritzy part of town. It makes no emotional sense or common sense, but that's how it works. And I'd say that's all algorithms. I will go further, by the way, if you don't mind. And I make this case in the book, but it's becoming more and more apparently true since the book came out 5 years ago, which is that the insurance companies are all vying, they're dying to use big data at scale in every single conceivable direction. If they do that, then insurance will actually no longer work. Like, just think about health insurance, right? Right now we have this rule that you can't charge somebody more for a pre-existing condition, which is, thank God we have that rule. Because if we didn't have that rule, the health insurers would be doing that. By the way, there is no rule that you can't charge more for a future existing condition. So there are such things as risk scores for diabetes, for example. And there's nothing technically illegal about charging more for that. But my point is that, like, really, if you think about it from the perspective of an insurance company, they want to get the healthiest people possible on their insurance policy. And they want to get rid of people who are either quite sick or will be quite sick. And they can use big data techniques to really figure this out. It used to be just impossible for them to know, but now it's not. And I guess they can do it. And if they do it, then what will happen? What will happen is only people who don't need insurance will have insurance, and people who actually need insurance won't have insurance. And insurance itself will have failed its social contract. So I'm just saying that even though every insurance company is individually incentivized to sort and sift through people with big data techniques as much as possible, it is actually cannibalizing their own industry at the end of the day.
Okay, I have a comment and a question. I think, yes, we already began to see this with the Obamacare, where this difficulty about who was going to be left over, and was the state going to have to pick up all the cases of the people that had existing or were going to have conditions, and the private company sector was going to insure the healthy. So the specter of this has been in our face actually for a while. I want to just back up for a second before we move forward and ask about this point that you made about one person has a a driving while intoxicated indicator on his record, and another person lives in a bad neighborhood, and you're sort of saying, well, it's worse to live in a bad neighborhood than have a perfect driving record than to live in a good neighborhood and have been caught drunk driving. The question I have about that relates to this point we made early on, and that is, are these companies actually evaluating what we used to call, and I'm a former social worker, we used to wonder about program evaluation. I actually worked in a psychiatric unit in Boston where we gave parents all kinds of advice and told them they had to bring their kids in and blah, blah, blah. And we never really did any follow-up to see whether our intervention was making any difference at all. Now, I admit it's complicated to do that, but for these insurance companies, it's not. So to what extent, if any, is the private sector engaged in actually testing I think you call it post-testing or something, the efficacy of their models?
Yeah, I think what you have to understand is that they're not in the business of actually charging people for their risk. They're in the business of charging people as much as money as they can charge people. And especially when you think about it, something like car insurance, where people need car insurance, it's required if you want to drive a car legally. It's not something that they can really shop around on. There is a actual algorithm that I've heard about, a scoring system that insurance companies use, which is how likely is this person to shop around for better prices. And if they're unlikely to do that because they have 2 jobs and too many kids to take care of and they're busy, then they will raise the premiums faster. It has nothing to do with their actual risk. So I guess what I'm saying is I'm pushing back on your premise a little bit as to like, are they tracking their risk? I think they're tracking their profits. They're maximizing their profits. They also have a, by the way, there's another algorithm scoring system I heard. What is the likelihood that this person will file, if their claim gets rejected, will hire a lawyer? And that's, again, for people who aren't likely to hire a lawyer, they're just going to reject the claims at a higher rate because they're not worried about it. So that's another thing that will screw the poor people who don't have access to a lawyer. I'm just saying that there's all sorts of tricky things here that you'd think that insurance as an industry that has a duty to care would deal with more ethically, but big data is just too much fun for them. It's like, as an opportunity, it is so ripe because it is easier to maximize profit than it is to like care about risk per se.
Yeah, well, it just seems to me that maybe the actual probability of the insurance company having to pay out will be higher for the former drunk than for the non, and therefore they would maximize their profits more if they actually did a better job of risk assessment.
I see what you're saying. I'm just saying that, like, it's not about maximizing. It's not just about risk. It's about how much money can we charge? How much can we get away with charging? Yeah, so you're right. You're right. They might have actually, like, they're charging that guy. I mean, I'm cynically speaking, they're charging that guy a lot in order to like cover his risk, which is high. They're charging the other person way more because they can.
Right. Well, right. Okay. Plus, I mean, there are other factors. There's inertia. I mean, there's all kinds of reasons why people might not go an additional step or change their behavior. I don't want to oversimplify either. Okay. Look, we have about 5 minutes left. So what I'd like to do is ask the following. So first, I want to kind of summarize what I think I've heard, and then I want to ask you a sort of activism question. So I see your main points as, first, algorithms more often evaluate the poor than the rich, or the weak than the strong. The people affected by algorithms rarely understand the decision-making process and are in no position to evaluate their fairness. Even if they suspected problems, they're probably powerless to do anything about it. And once in place, algorithms are rarely evaluated to determine if they actually do what they're supposed to do. So my question to you, now that I know you're also somewhat of an activist, is how can members of the public fight back? Has there been any legislative or regulatory action? And what can we do as concerned citizens to make the powers that be use algorithms in a more humane fashion?
Yeah, I mean, the movie Coded Bias was a big step in this direction. I've spoken to many policymakers as often as I can. I've talked to insurance commissioners. I've spoken, to try to spread this information. Of course, it always pops up on social media simply because people every now and then do figure out that the algorithm is biased and they're really pissed. But I'd say what I'd like to see personally is an FDA for algorithms. I think everybody has a pretty strong model of the FDA at this point because of what's been happening with vaccines. A pharmaceutical company has to make the case with evidence that it is both safe and effective. So effective means at least as good as what used to be there. So algorithms have to be at least as good as judges, for example. But you actually have to say what it means to be good, and that's what we don't see with that argument, right? What is the definition of success? How do we know it's at least as good? And just being more consistent isn't enough. We have to say what it means to actually work. And then what does it mean to be safe? An algorithm is safe, for protected classes. It doesn't discriminate. Make that case. Show me the evidence. And I guess my point is that the FDA model is good because it shifts the burden onto the pharmaceutical company before they can sell the drug. They can experiment with people with consent, but they can't foist a product that doesn't work on the public. So the current algorithms are essentially like, here's a medicine that doesn't work, kills people, but it kills more Black people than white people. Pay for it, thank you very much. I mean, it's like so wrong. And yet the burden seems to be on the victims because they're the ones, like the teachers, who are getting fired and don't have an appeal system. So it's crazy. It's a really mixed up situation. And so the answer is we need to shift the burden onto the makers of these before they deploy it. You may have to argue, you insurance company or social media company, argue for the deployment of this algorithm, make the case, and we might say no. That's not an answer to your question because it's not something that an individual can insist on, but it is a kind of larger campaign. To answer that question, it's really hard for an individual to push back against it. It's a mechanism of power to wage war against the powerless. So it's really, really hard for a given person to wrap their hands around it.
Okay, well, I'm afraid we are out of time. That's a very, very insightful kind of summary. It reminds me a little bit of some of the environmental issues as well, or plastics or whatever, where we really have to get after the producers, right? And,
Yes.
and not simply focus on the consumers. So concerned citizens, thanks, Cathy O'Neill, for taking the time to enlighten our viewers about algorithmic injustice. As technology advances, we should not be surprised that it is co-opted by the powerful to create new forms of oppression. As concerned citizens, our job is to be vigilant and fight back. So thanks again, Cathy O'Neill, for raising our consciousness about this worrisome phenomenon. And thank you, our audience, for joining us. We look forward to seeing you again next time.